No scope! Nice!
And don't skip this part because I want to tell you some interesting and important things.
You're teasing me, you naughty naughty.
First of all, while other videos are testing mostly with 3.1 versus XeSS 1.3 versus DLSS 3.7, I'm testing also TAA, which is the native anti-aliasing, basically native resolution, versus FSR 2.1 or FSR 2.2, depends on the game, versus FSR 3.1 versus XeSS 1.3 versus DLSS 3.7. And the games that do not support DLSS 3.7, I actually downloaded the DLL files and upgraded the game to DLSS 3.7. And another thing that I made differently is that I actually tested FSR and XeSS with an AMD GPU and DLSS with an NVIDIA one. Usually reviewers test DLSS FSR and XeSS on the same card, in this case an NVIDIA card, because once again it's easier since NVIDIA supports all the upscalers because XeSS and FSR are free. But in this case, since I wanted the results to be as accurate as possible, I used an AMD card for FSR and XeSS and an NVIDIA one for DLSS. And I could actually have used the ARC A770 for XeSS as well, because XeSS does work better quality-wise when running an Intel GPU, because we have the DP4A version for all the other GPUs, and then we have the XMX version of XeSS upscaling for those Intel Arc GPUs, meaning that in those Intel Arc GPUs it will work much better. But since the Intel Arc GPUs are such a small amount of the market, I thought it would be much more realistic to test it on an AMD GPU as well. But well, let's move forward and go to the part that you actually want to see, the comparisons. But before, today's video sponsor is GVG Mall, bringing you lots of software deals like Windows 10, Windows 11, Office 2019 or 2021 with a new Windows 11 design, and for all of these you can use my SKG discount code for 30% off, getting a Windows 11 serial key for $22 and a Windows 10 one for only $15. Then use the key on your Windows settings and you'll have an activated system. We start with TAA, which is native 4K, versus FSR 2.2 and FSR 3.1, both using the performance mode, which means they'll be upscaling from 50% of the native resolution, in this case 1080p to 4K. And visually wise the differences are quite small actually, being the only difference noticeable in the rain, where both FSR versions have almost no water drops falling on Alloy's clothes, and FSR 3.1 actually has a huge issue with ghosting regarding the water particles, that leave a trail behind every time you look at them, being even worse than FSR 2.2 in that detail. Although as we zoom in we can see FSR 3.1 delivering better image fidelity, and you can see that if you look for example to Alloy's hair. With FSR 2.2 we get a pixelated output, while with FSR 3.1 it is much smoother, kind of blending in much better as well. And it's just not the hair, it's the whole Alloy equipment if you actually look closely. And if we zoom in by quite a lot, we can see that none of the FSR versions can deliver anything close to native in terms of foliage here, maybe due to the rain happening in the scene, but FSR 3.1 once again looks less pixelated and generally retains more detail. When comparing FSR 3.1 to XeSS 1.3 and DLSS 3.7, things get interesting though, because if you look closely in terms of temporal stability, FSR 3.1 works very well. In here, for example, if you look at the lines in Alloy's vest, you can see that FSR 3.1 shimmers less than the others. But with XeSS 1.3 and DLSS 3.7, you can easily see the raindrops hitting Alloy and kind of doing the splashing effect, while with FSR 3.1, they magically disappear and get the power of ghosting. Guess basically that's it. Now, if we really want to be picky, XeSS 1.3 already has some kind of dragging effect in some areas, with DLSS being the best pick here of course, and FSR 3.1 actually delivers more detail, if you didn't notice, than both XeSS 1.3 and DLSS 3.7 in terms of texture quality. If you look at the pillars, for example, you'll see the difference. But once again, the whole FSR 3.1 experience is kind of ruined by the ghosting that we can see here. Well, at least for me. In the scene we have no rain, but we do have lots of things like insects flying around, which is great to see if we have ghosting the same way we do with the raindrops. And it seems that here there was no visible improvement in terms of particles like this with the new FSR 3.1, which is quite disappointing. And if we kind of nitpick a bit, well, we can see that the FSR 3.1 has more ghosting with its particles as well than FSR 2.2. So instead of getting better here, they actually got worse. But once again, as we zoom in, we can see that it does increase the temporal stability and retains considerably more detail than FSR 2.2, that looks way more pixelated most of times, like you can see for example in the still shot in Aloy's hair. And even if you look at the bow and ropes, you can see how much better they look with FSR 3.1, so I guess it was a trade-off. As we test XeSS 1.3 and DLSS 3.7 as well, they all look pretty close in the scene, with FSR 3.1 having less shimmer, but as soon as we zoom in this place, we can see that the particles have a big ghosting trail with FSR 3.1, something that does not happen with DLSS. Although I believe that XeSS 1.3 takes the crown here, having slightly lower ghosting than DLSS 3.7. So overall, FSR 3.1 brings more temporal stability than you can see by looking at Aloy's quiver, for example, but at the same time, it is the worst one with any scene that has particles flying around, for example, or any kind of water particles, producing extreme ghosting in some scenarios. And well, since we'll have lots of jungle scenes, so why not test one here? In this scene things look basically the same actually, but with FSR 3.1 performing better with higher stability and more detail, since this scene doesn't really have any particles flying around, and if you look closely, you can see a lot of pixelation with FSR 2.2, like in Aloy's bow, and the background close to it, while FSR 3.1 kind of cleans that up and makes things look way better. And testing normal foliage, well, all three performed pretty well, with even FSR 2.2 working very well here. And when testing XeSS 1.3 and DLSS 3.7 in this scene, I actually got a surprise, where FSR 3.1 was the best one here, with a lower amount of pixelation that appears a lot around Aloy's bow, for example, with XeSS 1.3, and even with DLSS 3.7, showing that FSR 3.1 is in the right way, but AMD really needs to fix those issues that they have with water and transparent particles or pixels. And to finish the Horizon Forbidden West part, we have the movement comparisons, and this is where the DLSS 3.7 shows its superiority. Something that can be seen in this still, where the DLSS delivers way less pixelation and overall much more detail in Aloy's clothes. Although FSR 3.1 was indeed an upgrade from 2.2, especially in movements like these, with the only sad thing, well, being the added ghosting, that is also present in some parts of the movements. XeSS 1.3 on the other hand does a very decent job with movement as well, handling very well the water particles and delivering basically no ghosting in the movements, while also delivering less pixelation than FSR 3.1. And if you're asking yourself why XeSS 1.3 uses the balanced instead of performance, is because Intel changed the presets with XeSS 1.3, and now the balanced mode is the one using 50% of the native resolution, while before it was the performance mode, like with AMD and Nvidia. With Ratchet and Clank, things seem to be more or less the same at first sight, but not really. As we zoom in, for example, we can see the particles from the bottom side of the platform up ahead are basically non-existent with FSR upscaling, while with native 4K, it kind of works like a charm, giving more life to the scene. If you look at the jet engines though, you can see that FSR 3.1 once again delivers a smoother image, while FSR 2.1 gets a pixelated image in comparison that also appears with FSR 3.1, but way less. And this is one of the scenes that shocked me the most, because I said several times before that FSR 3.1 handled particles quite poorly. And that's true, with lots of ghosting and so on, but as soon as we compared it to FSR 2.1, the improvement is abysmal. As with FSR 3.1 we have ghosting, but we can at least see the particles, while with FSR 2.1 they would just fade away. Now going FSR versus XeSS versus DLSS, man, I can already see the difference. And as we zoom in, remember what I told you about the particles in the bottom of the platforms? Look at how much better they look with XeSS and DLSS. That still managed to give you that galaxy feeling, while with FSR 3.1, all we get is a bunch of small blue dots there, kind of pixels. And look at the jets as well, where FSR 3.1 delivers pixelation close to those red rocks/plants, while XeSS and DLSS were completely fine in the same scenario. And things get even worse if we look at the confetti, where FSR 3.1 is completely slaughtered here. Because even though it was a great improvement over FSR 2.1, it is not near as good as XeSS 1.3 or DLSS 3.7 that managed to capture the particles and the audience in the back with virtually no ghosting. And now I'm testing one of those parts AMD showed when they announced FSR 3.1, but it seems that when upscaling from 1080p to 4K, FSR 2.2 quality is almost matching the one from FSR 3.1 with just a bit more pixelation. But as soon as we drop the resolution to 1440p, things get entirely different, and FSR 3.1 shows that it is much better than FSR 2.1 when upscaling from lower resolutions such as 720p. With the DLSS having an easy win in terms of motion clarity and overall detail, of course. But in the last scene we can see that it isn't always an easy win for the DLSS, with it retaining more detail on the bridge in the back, and especially the trees of course, but also having more shimmer and ghosting than XeSS 1.3. While FSR 3.1 is kind of the poor kid here, because it does have a bit more detail and stability than XeSS 1.3 with the far objects, but also introduces ghosting. So once again, it's kind of a trade-off. And to finish Ratchet and Clank, we have the movement comparison as well. And if you look closely around Rivet's body, you can see how much more pixelation we have compared to FSR 3.1. That seems to have improved in that department, well, let's call it that. But they're still quite behind XeSS 1.3 that delivers a softer image with no pixelation in the translucent parts, like the blue line you see from the attack, and no pixelation around the body as well. Not even mentioning the flying particles that have much less ghosting with XeSS 1.3. As we compare the three upscalers, well, DLSS 3.7 is the clear winner once again, more in terms of motion attack particles, which is kind of expected from the brand that brought upscaling to the market, I guess. With Spider-Man Remastered I decided to test at 1440p since the previous tests were all at 4K, so instead of 4K performance or balanced for XeSS, which was 50% of 4K, which is 1080p, we're now using 1440p quality, or ultra quality for XeSS, that uses 67% of 1440p, which is 960p. As you zoom in, you can see that even native resolution has some shimmering in some parts of the structure, in the bottom and the pipes in the top. And interestingly, even though FSR 2.1 does bring a lot more shimmering than FSR 3.1, it also delivers more information. But still, FSR 3.1 looks indeed closer to native than FSR 2.1. As we try XeSS and DLSS, things get on a different path, one where FSR 3.1 is now the middleman, performing worse than XeSS 1.3 in some things like the structure shimmering, but better than it when you look at the tree details, for example, that look kind of smudged with XeSS 1.3. DLSS 3.7 on the other hand delivers more detail overall, but also delivers less temporal stability in this scene, which is something that I wasn't expecting for sure. In this scene, all upscalers look quite good, with FSR 3.1 having a bit of ghosting in some parts, but something that the average Joe just wouldn't even notice. Although as we zoom into the buildings in the back, we can see that FSR 3.1 still shimmers a lot, and that's once again because FSR can't really handle the transparent / translucent pixels very well, while XeSS and DLSS deliver a very stable image. In here, DLSS is the best one as it delivers the same stability as XeSS, but retains more information in the trees as FSR 3.1. In this case, the best of both worlds. And now with a small comparison in between the two free-to-use upscaling technologies, just to say that XeSS 1.3 is not always better than FSR 3.1. In this case, for example, using ray tracing, you can see XeSS delivering a horrible shimmering in the water and foliage around it. And the same happens here with FSR 3.1 handling the floor and truck reflections much better than XeSS 1.3 does with all that shimmering, which is actually great. But as soon as we move from reflections to a scene with lots of transparent or translucent pixels, FSR 3.1 does a horrible job as well. This is an outstanding difference. While XeSS 1.3 delivers perfect lines and translucent backgrounds the right way, I'm even stuttering, FSR 3.1 just makes everything shimmer, which completely breaks the experience in scenarios like these. And if we look a bit to the left, it is exactly the same, with FSR 3.1 delivering an insane amount of shimmering, while XeSS 1.3 delivers a stable and smooth image overall. Very interesting results here. With this all said and done, let's move to the final thoughts. And well guys, conclusion. Well, I can tell you that FSR 3.1 did bring some really important things for AMD upscaling technology and even for frame generation. The first one is that FSR 3.1 finally decoupled the frame generation from the upscaler, meaning that all games that support FSR 3.1 will allow you to use AMD FSR 3 frame generation without upscaling, meaning that you can use frame generation with native resolution, you can use it with XeSS, DLSS, even DLSS. Having FSR 3.1 in a game is already a big plus even for NVIDIA users that are using, for example, RTX 2000 and 3000 cards, because they can use DLSS but they can't use frame generation from NVIDIA, so they can actually use the frame generation from AMD alongside the DLSS upscaling. So they already have to thank AMD for that, because AMD's frame generation is actually very good, so it's a plus, it's a win-win for them. As for AMD users, they can use FSR 3.1 and XeSS 1.3. As for XeSS 1.3, it was a major upgrade in some scenarios versus XeSS 1.1 and 1.2, as you can see in this video passing right now on the screen. In some scenarios it was really a big difference in terms of stability and so on, and versus FSR 3.1 that also improved stability, it is kind of a mix. In some scenarios FSR 3.1 is better, in other scenarios XeSS 1.3 takes the crown. In everything just related to temporal stability, FSR 3.1 actually does a very good job. But since they focus so much on improving the temporal stability, what they ended up with was ghosting, and we can see ghosting especially in water particles and so on. And if you go and use FSR 2.1, 2.2 and even the FSR 3.1 in any scene that has water moving, so basically translucent or transparent particles or pixels, it will be a complete mess with FSR. Just a complete mess. It will look very bad. It will look just really pixelated and the overall image will suck, completely suck. While if you do the same for XeSS, it will be much better. XeSS handles those situations much better. Even though it has some more shimmering here and there, overall it handles the lining and the transparent / translucent pixels much better and very much on par with the DLSS in some scenarios. So XeSS is kind of the middle ground, although if you're running an AMD GPU, FSR will give you more FPS, so there's a trade-off once again. XeSS is the middle ground in terms of performance and quality, and well, the DLSS can only be used with NVIDIA cards, so it is what it is. And another great thing is that on top of decoupling the frame generation with FSR 3.1, we actually have now finally a DLL file in the game folder as well, meaning this, that you can just go there As soon as, for example, AMD release FSR 3.2, you can just go to any game that supports FSR 3.1, just copy the DLL files, basically copy the new upscaler version, copy it to the game, run it, and the game will automatically run with FSR 3.2. The same way we do with DLSS. Some of these games actually have the DLSS 3.5 instead of the DLSS 3.7, so what I had to do is go download the DLL file for the DLSS 3.7, just copy, paste it on the game folder, overwrite the previous file if I want to, and now we have the DLSS 3.7. The same way we also do with XeSS. You just go and download XeSS 1.3, and all the games that have XeSS 1.1 and 1.2 can be upgraded to XeSS 1.3 as well. But just to finish, if you ask me which one would I pick, and generally I pick XeSS. If I have the frame generation option to use, I'll just use XeSS Ultra Quality, which is now the quality mode, 67%, XeSS Ultra Quality and frame generation from AMD, because frame generation from AMD is actually very good. Much better than most people think, and usually gives more FPS than the Nvidia one, even on Nvidia cards, of course. And in terms of quality, it just doesn't stay behind. It is actually very good. Once again, I tested it, for example, on Starfield, and I have way more artifacts moving the camera with Nvidia DLSS frame generation than FSR 3 frame generation. So, well, you know. And well, guys, that's all for today's video. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. By the way, I kind of feel that I'm being kind of bottlenecked as well by the camera that I have currently, which is basically a 1080p camera. Everything else that I do on video is 4K, but in terms of recording itself is at 1080p because the camera is at 1080p. And some reviews that I make, I kind of feel bottlenecked by the camera in terms of video quality, and I will be getting a new camera, although the new camera costs like 2,000 euros. So if you ever thought of donating anything, maybe this would be the right time, because I just bought a house, and well, I just spent a lot of money, and I will spend more because I'm actually doing my studio and so on. And if you guys could help, let's say even with €1 for PayPal, for example, to PayPal, it would be really nice, and a really appreciated help to buy the camera. If you can't, there's no issue whatsoever, because, well, we're still friends, and I thank you very much for watching the channel, which is the most important thing. Thank you once again, and see you in the next video, guys. Cheers.